Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. With us today, Avi Hoffman from Yeshiva University. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The Parsha we are about to discuss is Parshat Tetzaveh in the book of Exodus, the book of Shmot. This Parsha continues giving us the instructions concerning the tabernacle, focusing on the role of the priesthood. The Parsha reports God's commands to bring olive oil for the lamp, make sacred garments for the priests, conduct an ordination ceremony, and make an incense altar. The first pasuk of the Parsha says, "You shall further instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for kindling lamps regularly. ואתה תצווה את בני ישראל ויקחו אליך שמן זית זך כתית למאור להעלות נר תמיד." So, we can talk about many things when we look at this Parsha, but let's begin with Moses. Where is Moses in our story of tabernacle and priesthood?
Yeah, Moshe is not mentioned anywhere in Parshat Tetzaveh. I think it's the first time since we heard about him first on the beginning of Sefer Shmot that he's not mentioned. And there's a lot of talk about why Moshe wouldn't appear in this week's Parsha. But for me, it's a much more practical Torah learning consideration, and that is that one can't learn any one part of Torah out of context or in a bubble. And that is that if one were to only learn Parshat Tetzaveh, they'd never be introduced to Moshe, and they would go through an entire Parsha in the Torah not knowing the central character of Torah's Moshe.
Although in the first pasuk when God says "Ve'ata tetzaveh," when you shall command, we assume that he speaks to Moses, right?
Yeah, no, we know he's talking about Moshe because we've read Parshas Truma and Parshas Yisro and Parshas Mishpatim. But if someone only read Parshas Tetzaveh, they'd be left a bit confused or missing some information.
Right.
So there are many, obviously this applies to everything, all kinds of learning, not just in Torah. But there are a few specific examples that I've realized in Torah learning how one can't take one line out of context, and if one does, it's so easy to miss out on a broader picture. So, for example, in Masechet Brachot, there is a very interesting story about Rabbi Abba, who's running away from his Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Abba is a big Zionist. He wants to move to the land of Israel. And Rabbi Yehuda held that he would be over an aseh. He was committing a negative mitzvah in the Torah if he would leave Babel and go to Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
So the Gemara goes and talks a little bit about that. But Rabbi Abba was running away from Rabbi Yehuda for wanting to go to Eretz Yisrael. But then, about 20 pages later, the Gemara talks about oil, the oil of Eretz Yisrael, and asks, what bracha is one supposed to make on the oil? And so one Amora says, maybe we should follow Rabbi Yehuda and say, Borei Shemen Artseinu, the creator of the oil of our land. And everyone else knocks that down. Why? Because that's Rabbi Yehuda's bracha. And Rabbi Yehuda, as everyone knows, loves Eretz Yisrael. Chaviv alei Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
So if you only looked at one story and you only saw the story of Rabbi Abba running away from Rabbi Yehuda,
you'd assume that Rabbi Yehuda is not appreciative of the land.
We would assume that. And if we only saw the other one, we'd assume he's this incredible, passionate Zionist. Everyone has to run and move to Israel. But neither is entirely true. We have to see both of them. And really, we'd also have to look at everything else Rabbi Yehuda says and take it in the full context. And that's the importance of learning Torah as a whole and not just learning one or two pieces and taking them out of context.
Okay, so I'm convinced I'm sold on the idea that context is important. Now, what is the context of our Parsha when we look at it and we don't see Moshe?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wonder if it has something to do with the fact of the way the Parshot are broken up. So this becomes more a question of why that specific Parsha was broken up by there without a specific reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's a very interesting question, something to think about.
Right. Would you assume that this is intentional, or maybe this is just a slip? Someone didn't notice that he creates a parsha without Moshe's name in it.
So I'm sure that if somebody would study and look at this parsha a lot deeper, they'd come to more interesting conclusions than I have currently. But I tend to think that, when we're dividing the Torah, necessarily we're going to leave things out and things are going to be out of context. So when they broke up the Parshot, I would assume that, based on the divisions, Moshe just got left out, and it's not much more interesting than that, but I'm sure somebody could come up to much more interesting conclusions than I have.
Right. Let me make a suggestion and see where we go from there. Maybe because this parsha deals so much with the role of the Kohanim, of the priests, and with the oil that they need, and with the ceremonies that they conduct, and maybe that's why they feel that mentioning Moshe will somehow reduce the level of importance that we attribute to the Kohanim. We do not want to mention him by way of elevating them to be the most important characters in our own parsha.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. And we know that Moshe was the first ever Kohen Gadol, or at least the acting Kohen Gadol. For the inauguration of the Mishkan, he actually wore all 8 of the Big Day Kahuna, or Big Day Kahuna Gedola. And he went and he lit the menorah and he did all that. But then making that separation and showing that Moshe is not part of the Kohanim, that he has a separate role, that is an interesting suggestion. And it almost makes me think of Moshe's inability to get into the land of Eretz Yisrael. Right? The Kohanim are ultimately a Yerushalayim position. They are the ones who are in the Beit HaMikdash. And Moshe doesn't get there. And also, interestingly, a couple weeks ago, we had Parshat Yisro, right, where we went to Har Sinai and got the Torah. It seems to me that Parsha represents one of two destinations the Jews have once they leave Mitzrayim. They try to get to Har Sinai as one destination to get the Torah, but the second destination, they try to go to Eretz Yisrael and actually get their own land. And it raises the question of what are we? Are we a nation of destination Har Sinai of the Torah, or are we a nation of destination Eretz Yisrael of the land? And Moshe never gets there. And also, interestingly, Torah's Moshe also doesn't get there. We only get to Eretz Yisrael once we get to Sefer Yoshua. So this idea of differentiating Moshe from the Levium, differentiating Moshe from Eretz Yisrael, is a very interesting suggestion and one that we should think more about.
Right, and when we read the Parsha, there's also a reason for us to think in general about the division of roles between, the leader and the priest and the people. We are a nation of priests, Mamlechet Kohanim, and still not all of us can be priests.
Correct, yeah. That is interesting, how there are different kinds of roles, the Levium, the Kohanim, the Israelim.
Should we be disturbed or annoyed by the fact that some people get to do the work in the Mishkan and we don't? Well, I don't. I'm not sure if you're a Kohen or not,
either.
But okay. So is this something that should bother the other Israelites?
So that's a very interesting question. I totally understand people who are bothered by it. Me personally, I can only answer from my own perspective.
Sure, please do.
It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me so much because just based on my role and the things that I've gotten to do, I'm pretty satisfied with the religious opportunities that I have in front of me. And also, it might be a product of being a Gullus Jew, of not having the Beit HaMikdash, and really there being no specific advantage that Kohanim and Leviim have over me today. Were we living in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, where there were actually sacrifices and more of a role that Kohanim and Leviim played, I might have a different opinion. So I definitely understand the people who come from that perspective and want to approach God in that way, and they feel they don't have enough of an access point to get to Hashem. I definitely hear that perspective.
Right. Avi Hoffman, I feel that some of my questions were probably a bit too difficult for anyone to answer, so I apologize for asking such questions, and I thank you for sharing your thoughts on Parshat Tetzaveh with us, and wish you Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.